Good day. I'm Cyrus Mansouri, and today we're going to be talking about divorce and how to start the divorce process and how to get it going. Now, I'm going to break down this particular introduction into two sections. So, we're going to talk about how to start your divorce and to get the petition rolling. But I'm also going to add in a slight section afterwards in a separate podcast, which is going to detail some of the facts that you need to rely on under the current law. Now, I mentioned the current law. Today is the 12th of September 2020. And the reason that's important is because divorce law is constantly evolving. So, what I'm telling you is valid as of today's date. It's not likely to change much until around about the autumn of 2021, when some new regulations are going to be coming in, and the whole of the divorce process in England and Wales is going to effectively change quite significantly for the first time since 1973. So it's a pretty big change. But at the moment, none of that is particularly relevant. So today we're going to talk about the law as it is. I've been practicing in divorce and all of the associated areas that are related to it for quite a long time now. It's about 30 years, and that includes financial disputes relating to separation and also where they exist disputes in relation to children and custody and all sorts of contact and things like that. But to get started, one of the questions I get asked quite often is we weren't married in England, so how or why should we get a divorce here? Well, it is relevant because you are legally married no matter where you get married in the world, as long as the marriage that you had was legal in the place that you did it. So it doesn't matter where you did it, but as long as it was legal there, it's going to be legal here. And you are married. You're obviously married. You were married right up until the day you decided you didn't want to be married, so nothing's changed. There's no legal reason why you're not. And the reality is that anyone who can show that they're either habitually resident in England or Wales or that they're domiciled here can divorce here. So you don't have to be British. You don't have to have married in this country. You don't even need to have spent most of your life here. Indeed, really, what the law wants to see is that you've been here at least 6 months. And if you haven't been here 6 months, there can still be occasions when you can divorce here, where you can show that the substantial number of assets that you own or that you have a strong connection with England and Wales. Now, I do mention England and Wales because everything I'm saying is only related to those two countries. It's got nothing to do with Scotland, which has its own laws, and I, quite frankly, don't know a lot about them, but it's a completely different legal system. So, if you're going to be divorcing in England, you're either going to be the one who starts the divorce or the person who's on the receiving end of it. Now, the person who starts the divorce is called a petitioner, and they are the ones that kickstarts everything. They're generally the person who's going to be paying for it, at least in the first place, and then they'll have an opportunity to claim that back from the respondent, and that's the person who's at the receiving end of the divorce. Very often, it doesn't really matter which side of it you're on. It doesn't have any significant consequences in relation to financial issues later on if you've got a dispute. It doesn't particularly matter who started the divorce, and it certainly doesn't have any impact in relation to any disputes that might exist with regard to children. So it's not hugely important whether you're the petitioner or the respondent, except in perhaps I would say that the petitioner has a lot of control over the speed at which this divorce is going to go ahead. So if you're the respondent and you are in a hurry, you know, you're on the receiving end of the divorce, but you're in a rush, you'd rather get this done, then it's not a good position to be in, because unless the petitioner is also in a hurry or also keen to get things done as quickly as possible, you could end up being significantly delayed. So if speed is important for you, you would want to be the petitioner. Now, there are basically, at present, at the time that I'm recording this, there's a couple of ways in which you can petition for your divorce. You can do it in the old-fashioned way, which is download the forms off the internet or even ask the court to send them to you. and fill them in on paper. But you could also use the new system, which is the online divorce system that's been introduced, and it's pretty good. It's streamlined, it's fast, it's effective, it works. And I'm going to concentrate on that today. But I should stress that what I'm going to talk about is pretty much the same whether you're filling in the form or you're going online, because it's pretty much the same questions, and the things that I'm going to suggest are pretty much the same answers. If you want to go on the online system, you'll have to create a user profile and name at the website, and then you're straight in. Now, assuming you're the petitioner, that's the person who's starting this, what you're going to have to do is complete the form with the basic details to start with. So the first few questions naturally are going to be: who are you? Who's your spouse? Name, address, dates of birth. You want to be precise with the name. It will also ask you whether the name that they were born with is the name that they have on the marriage certificate, because it's very important that we have the name that's on the marriage certificate. The court will want to see that. And if the person's got, if they use a couple of different names, it's very common. People use a nickname and they're well known by that nickname. Or some people with very long surnames will cut it down into a shorter version. You want to mention that at this point. You want to say that this is the real name of the person, the full name on their passport or birth certificate, but they're also known as, and that also known as is often reduced down to AKA so and so, whatever the other name is. So that does need to be mentioned. I did mention about the subject of residence, habitual residence, or domicility or domicile. That is important. You'll be asked about that also on the next page. Are you domiciled or habitually resident in England and Wales? Now, for the great majority of people watching this, the answer to that question is going to be yes. You're probably living here, or you're British, or it's a combination of both of them. But there are occasions when someone might think, well, hang on a minute, I live here, but my spouse doesn't. They work offshore, or they live in another country. Can I get a divorce in England? Well, the short answer to that is yes, you probably can. As long as one of you is domiciled here, then it doesn't really matter. You may ask yourself, well, I'm not British. Can I divorce in England and Wales? Well, again, the answer is yes. If this is where you are habitually resident and domiciled, you can divorce in England and Wales no matter what nationality you hold. So it's not hugely contentious as long as one of you can be shown to be habitually living in England or Wales. And again, I stress the England and Wales bit. If you're living in Scotland, in Aberdeen or in Edinburgh or one of those cities, then that's going to be different. Okay, so you need to then consult someone regarding the law as it relates to Scotland. We've moved on from the basic details, the habitual residence. Now, the address, I occasionally get consulted by people who say to me, well, I don't want my spouse to know where I'm now living because maybe there's been issues of domestic violence, maybe there's been threats, maybe there's just a lot of animosity. And you just don't want that information out there. Well, the form online and also the paper form allows you to withhold your address. That means keep it secret. So your spouse will not know what it is, but you still have to tell the court what your address is. And they'll keep that under wraps, so the other side won't be able to find out. So that's an option. It's a tick box. You'll tick it, and then it'll go on with the questions. It's going to ask you, where do you live and why don't you want them to know? Which you can just put in a sentence there and say, for example, I've been a victim of domestic violence, or I fear my spouse, or they've been sending me some, threatening messages, or whatever the case is, whatever it is that relates to you. Now, there is only one. The next question is the ground for your divorce. Well, there's only one ground in English law for a divorce, and that is that your marriage has to have irretrievably broken down. Now, those words mean pretty much what they mean in plain English, irretrievably, which pretty much means that there's no hope of a conciliation. You've got to the end. At the end of your tether, you've got to the point where you have absolutely come to the conclusion this is over. So that basically what that word means, and broken down, obviously, also just as its ordinary English language meaning. It basically means that there is no hope, at least in your mind as the petitioner, of a reconciliation. So you've got to tick that box. It'll be asked a question: has your marriage irretrievably broken down? And you're going to have to be ticking yes if you're petitioning for a divorce. If you tick no, this is not going to go any further. Now, moving on from that, the current law says that the ground for divorce, which is the irretrievable breakdown, has to be supported by one of 5 facts. Now, those 5 facts they're set out in the law, so it's not a matter of choice. You can't just pick something. It's got to be one of these 5, and this is something I'm going to tell you what they are now. But I'm also going to be putting out a second podcast about more detail about these 5 facts, because there's quite a bit to explain about them. But the 5 facts, basically in summary, are number 1, adultery. Number 2, unreasonable behavior. Number 3 is what we call the amicable ground for divorce, which is 2 years separation with the consent of your spouse. That means they agree to it. Number 3 is the 5-year separation ground. That is where your spouse has left you for a period of at least 5 years. And the last one, which I must admit is a very unusual one, and we don't really get them very often, is called desertion, which basically means abandonment. It means that my spouse has deserted me, and they must have done that at least 2 years before the date that you petition. It is an unusual one. I don't get many of them. The majority of people are going to fall under the first 3: adultery, unreasonable behavior, or the 2-year separation with consent. The 2-year separation with consent, you must have the agreement of your spouse that they will sign and agree to this divorce going ahead. If you do not have that agreement, you cannot use that ground, and if you go ahead with it, you're going to face a delay and you'll be very unhappy about it. So it does need agreement, but the rest of them, they don't need any agreement. So whether or not your spouse likes it or not, you can proceed on unreasonable behavior or adultery, or the other 2, which is the desertion or the 5 years separation. As I said, I'll be talking more about them in detail in the second one. If you're going with adultery, you'll be asked whether you want to name the person that your spouse has had an adulterous relationship with. Now, that's something that you need to think about carefully. I'm going to come on to it again in the second podcast, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but you do need to think carefully about that for various reasons, and this is a point where you might think to yourself that it might be worth taking some legal advice specifically about your circumstances. If you do name the adulterous third party who's had the relationship with your spouse, I should point out there's a couple of things you should remember. Firstly, that adultery needs to have occurred in the last 6 months. So there's no point doing this if it happened 10 years ago. For example, and you continued to live with your spouse after it happened. So that's not going to help. But the second one is that if you do name them, sometimes you can claim your costs against them too. That's obviously going to be very contentious and something that we want to tread a bit more cautiously with. But as I said, we'll talk about that in the next podcast. Moving on, there is a fee to pay for the majority of people. That at the moment is £550. These fees occasionally change, most often in April. At the end of the financial year, the courts will review fees, and obviously they'll only ever rise, they never go down. This £550 fee has not changed for a few years, but it is liable to. Now, if you consult us, we'll obviously tell you what the fee is the day we see you. But if you're doing this on your own, you want to double check that, and the online form indeed will simply take you in that direction anyway, because it's going to want the payment. Now, some people are eligible to not pay that fee. That is people who are either on a very low income, or they just simply have very little money, or maybe they're just on benefits, certain what they call passporting benefits like universal credit and things like that. They can automatically entitle you to an exemption from paying the court fee. But if you are going down that route, you're going to need to have applied for your exemption before you do any of the things I've just been talking about. So that on the same site where you start your petition for divorce, one of the first few questions was, are you paying or are you applying for an exemption? If you tick yes, I'm applying for exemption, it'll then say, well, you can't petition now. You first have to apply for the exemption, and it will take you to another page where you'll fill those forms in, you'll upload your bank statements, and if you've got pay slips or your benefits information, and then if they accept your application not to pay, they'll give you a code number, and then you'll be entering that code number onto the petition, and then you can carry on with what I'm describing here. So that's the point of paying. You're then going to get asked as to whether or not there are any other cases between you and your spouse. So if you've been in court about anything else between the two of you, you need to mention that, the name of the court case number, and they'll want an idea of the approximate date, or the exact date if you remember it. That's even better. So if you've got a non-molestation order or a dispute relating to the children, or even if there's been a criminal prosecution that's relevant to the marriage, then you want to mention that at that point in the petition, and it will go in there. Following on from there, the next stage is you're going to get asked, are you applying for any financial orders against your spouse? Now what this means is, this is talking about the finances of your marriage and whether there's any dispute. Indeed, there doesn't even need to be a dispute. Sometimes there can be an agreement. But the question really is there going to be any applications relating to finances? My general advice to you is usually tick the box yes, and the box below it, which is there's one box that says applying for finances for you. The box below it is applying for finances for your children. If you've got children, tick both of them, just to be on the safe side. This does not start any processes against your spouse for finances. It's just, as it were, reserving the right to make that application later. And if you don't tick these boxes, you'll hit a stumbling block one day in the future when you do want to make that application, and it'll cause you a delay and problems and a lot more cost. So my general advice is give it a tick, and if it's not something that you're going to be doing, then you can just ignore it and move on. Now, costs. That's usually the next page that's going to come up on the website with the questions. Are you seeking the cost of this divorce from your spouse? Obviously, it's a yes or no answer. If you're going with the yes, then they'll be asking you what your costs are. If you're doing this on your own and you're not using a solicitor, your costs are pretty much restricted to the court fee, £550. You're going to struggle to ask for any more. And no, for those of you who are wondering, you can't claim costs of your time. No. But if you did go to a lawyer and you paid the lawyer's fee, you can claim those, as long as they're what's called reasonable. It's a very wide word, no one knows what it means, but reasonable. So the solicitor's fees, lawyer's fees, or if you're using one of these online companies and you're paying them something, you can usually ask for that back. I should stress that simply asking for your costs and even getting a costs order doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see and receive those costs, because enforcing an order is a completely different matter. So that's the costs issue. It's a yes or no. It's up to you. You may have agreed with your spouse. For example, you agreed to the divorce. I won't claim costs. We do it quite often. It's a deal. It helps the thing to just go through faster and with more amicably, less dispute, less argument. At the end of the day, that's what we're aiming for here, isn't it? We're trying to keep the dispute to a minimum. And once you've answered that question, the next one is going to be uploading your documents. Now, this is on the website. On the paper version, you'll be expected to send your petition in triplicate, that's 3 copies, all signed up in an envelope with your marriage certificate. And if your marriage was not in English, not in England, and in a foreign language, you're going to have to have a certified translation of that certificate in the packet, and your check. If it's online, it's upload. So like with so many things in the world now, it's become more streamlined, easier, faster, and quite frankly more sensible. So you'll need a scan of your marriage certificate. Oddly enough, they even take pictures, which surprised me. So you can take a photo with your mobile phone and upload that. But do try and make it a clear one, because they will come back to you if there's something wrong with the picture. Even if there's a corner of the page that's missing out of the picture, or something's illegible or smudged or whatever, they're going to come back and say we need a better picture. So make it a good one. I suggest proper PDF scans. They're always the best. Once you've uploaded your documents, you've paid your fee, you've hit the submit button, the whole thing goes off, and it gets checked by, I presume, a human being. I don't know if it's a computer or a human, but somebody at the other end checks this. If it's all right, your debit card will get charged the fee, or your fee exemption, in which case you're not paying, and the petition is then what we call issued. Now you need to remember that you have not petitioned for a divorce until the court has issued it. Okay, so the fact that you've sent it to the court, that's not a divorce petition. The fact the court's received it, not a divorce petition. The fact the court's processing it, not a divorce petition. It's only when they've issued it, then it's a divorce petition. And that can be important. You might think I'm being a bit pedantic or silly here, but it can actually be important, because occasionally we have races to get a divorce petition in first, because there could be things happening either in England or in another jurisdiction somewhere in the world, and it is crucial that the first petition in is the one that's usually going to go ahead. So in some cases it can be very important, but the majority of the time it's not going to be hugely important. Once the court has issued your petition, they'll give it a case number. And on the online system, that'll come up on your login details, and you'll be able to manage your case online. And if it's paper, you'll receive a copy of it in the post. And what the court will normally be doing is they're going to send your petition to the respondent, that's your spouse, usually by post, and they're going to send them a form called an acknowledgement of service form. I'm going to do a complete podcast on that one separately, so I'm not going to talk about that now. And that podcast is going to be directed towards respondents and what do I do with an acknowledgement of service form, and what should I be thinking about. So that'll be a separate podcast, and it'll be coming probably in a couple of weeks. So that basically wraps up the divorce petition, and you've filed your petition, and soon it will be issued, and you're off the ground. You're up and running at this point. Now, the next podcast, which is coming after this, I'm going to go back to those 5 facts. The adultery, unreasonable behavior, 2 years separation, 5 years separation, and 2 years desertion. I'm going to go back to them, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them, because they can be important. They can be important for various reasons, but I'll leave that for the next podcast. Thank you very much for watching. If this video has been of any use to you or of any help, I'd be really grateful for the like, the tick up, and if you follow us, we'd be even more grateful. Thank you very much.